The Noah's Ark geoglyphs of Greater Mount Ararat, and those who lived on the mountain as well. Part number 2. Copyright 2003 to 2018, all rights reserved. As follows. We also learned that Greater Mount Ararat was not just a singular mountain where the Ark had landed, but qualified as mountains of Ararat according to Scripture, because it's not only larger Mount Ararat, but smaller Ararat, as we are zooming in here as well. However, we also learned that because of mountains behind this in the background, even gives more evidence that these are the mountains of Ararat where the Ark had landed. We also learned that before and after the global deluge, that lost historical flood legends show in the Central Island Eskimo and the Charlie Eastern Paraguay around 1700 BC that at one time there was no ice on the top of the mountains before the global flood. This even means Greater Mount Ararat, up to about 2250 BC or BCE. However, we entertained the next concept and asked the question, wondering if other lost historical and archaeological evidence that people lived on top of Greater Mount Ararat after Noah's Ark landed would be possible or not. We consider this now more in part 2. Emperor Yao, seen here in China, image courtesy of Wikipedia.org, wrote of a great flood that was above the hills and the mountains around the world. And yet, this is lost history and also archaeological evidence that this took place. How? This is described now more as follows. This is another image of Emperor Yao. However, in 2250 BCE, we want to keep our eye on that date, that he states in a global flood, quote, "Like endless boiling water, the flood is pouring forth destruction, boundless and overwhelming. It overtops hills and mountains, rising and ever rising. It threatens the very heavens. How the people must be groaning and suffering." Matter of fact, Emperor Yao continues to describe that the flood was so bad, and it is actually part of ancient Chinese history, that he mentions that the flood affected the entire population, and it was higher than the hills and the mountains. And later, he also describes that people were afraid of another flood. So they stayed on the mountain, but when they didn't, they dug deep channels to divert the water in case another great flood came again. And they were afraid to come down off the highest mountain, which according could be like Mount Ararat. And that way, if they were to dig great channels, they could divert the water away. And this was also recorded about, we have that year, later people were afraid another flood would come, so they dug deep channels to divert the water in case another great flood would come. Now, what is so important about this? First of all, let's use our common sense and logic. Why would Emperor Yao describe that the flood was so great that it even covered the highest hills and mountains? Yes, in China there are some large floods along the Yangtze and also the Yellow River. And there are also mountains that are not too far from these areas as well. But why would the emperor had talk about that the flood covered the entire hills and mountains? Was it to bring him more fame to make up a fanciful story? Was it to bring him more money? Or maybe was it because he was wise and he wanted to understand and he knew how history would record what he had to say? The 1901 to 1905 Chinese Asian related biblical archaeological document and evidence of a triangular-like shaped roof on a barge-like hull for Noah's Ark. In approximately 1905, in cooperation with King Christian IX of Netherlands, cooperated with also people who were archaeologists with the Chinese government. What they found was a approximate 2000 BCE document that not only named Greater Mount Ararat as Urt, but here Prince Michael of also King Christian the Ninth as well, who was a grandfather to many of the Russian emperors in that time of history, and Nicholas Tsar II, who eventually go to Noah's Ark as well, were very keenly interested in Noah's Ark. And not only did it showed a drawing from a side or a profile view of what Noah's Ark looked like as well, like a very steep roof on top of a barge-like hull. And it showed it in the bottom part, as we see in the left bottom corner, on a plateaued like cliff shelf, and it showed a ramp or a land bridge going from the bottom of the mountain all the way up to the top, which was apparently destroyed in the 1840 limited volcanic explosion and earthquake. Here we can see on the left the image. Here it's in color. On the top right, we see the outline red is what it shows what it looks like, the side view. And of course, part of the inside is just a hull or just a husk or a shell, and that part is missing. But it still has animal stalls on both ends and along the back wall. And what we can see here in the bottom one below that, in color, we can see the land bridge going up to the drawing of the ark. And the name that was mentioned where the ark had landed was the Mountain of Fire, or Urt, or Ararat, or Ararat. And that's what it said. And here, the yellow that we see with the reflection of the sun in the water as the waters abate as they go down on the Mountain of Fire or Mountain of Lava, Mount Ararat. And this is what the document said, almost identical to the story in Genesis of the global flood and of Noah's Ark as well. Yes, almost 1900 years later, the Roman and Jewish historian named Josephus records an identical story with very striking similarity. He says, now the sons of Noah were three, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, born 100 years before the deluge. These were the first descended from the mountains. And he records the same thing as the Chinese account, except that the second recording of this event is recorded in the 1st century CE by Josephus in 37 to 100 CE. Now, why is this highly unusual? It is highly unusual for this story to have been told and come from about 2250 BCE, and to be recounted and retold again almost 1,900 years later in a different part of the world under two completely separate, different types of governments, both the Roman government and the Jewish-influenced governments as well. Josephus gives striking similar account about what the people did, and are here likely on Mount Ararat, since that is where they believe the ark landed. And here, the similar Mount Ararat, mountains of Ararat, as we had previously discussed, he said they fixed their habitation there and persuaded others who were greatly afraid of the lower grounds on account of the flood, and so were very afraid to come down from the higher places to venture to follow their examples. The statement by Josephus shows that after the global flood, persons made habitations and lived on the mountain, the specific mountain where the ark landed, and where they originated from Noah, on today's greater Mount Ararat, but who were afraid to come down off Ararat because of the intense fear of another global deluge, just like what Emperor Yeo had talked about, that it got above the hills and the mountains. And yet they dug very large trenches in order to be able to avoid and divert the water in case another flood was to come again. Now let's go back and reiterate and consider that briefly just one more time for the following reasons. Okay, we're going to briefly rediscuss the following. And it says in the highlighted area, later people were afraid of another flood, so they first dug deep channels or trenches to divert the water in case another great flood came again. However, they were so afraid that they not only stayed on the highest mountain, near where the great flood occurred and where Noah's Ark had landed, but they refused to come down off the mountain as well. Therefore, the next question that needs to be asked is there any other evidence that these ancient canals were dug by ancient civilizations and cultures? Yes, they were. Now here is a NASA map, credit NASA, of Mount Ararat, where the blue arrows point to right there is a way the snow melts down and it eventually runs downward to the Araxes River, where the yellow arrows point to here in like manner as well. However, at the bottom of these approximate aqua-colored arrows are also giant canals that possibly and allegedly, according to the new evidence and data, were dug. Here is some new evidence on this. Here we see the Ahura Gorge on the northeast side of Mount Ararat. The aqua-colored arrows depict the glacial ice and snow from the frost line about 12,800 feet upwards. The yellow arrows indicate the way the snow runs down the mountain and then runs eventually to the Araxes River as well. Here's another view. The yellow arrows show the different ravines, etc., where the water runs down, eventually to the aqua-colored arrow at the bottom left corner. However, the sky-like blue-colored ravines are some of these possible canals that have been dug in the past to help divert water away from the mountain. So if people were to run up there and the water was diverted away, then it would avoid them drowning, possibly from the time right after Noah, 2250 BC. Now here is a lithograph from about 1913, and it shows Mount Ararat, but the arrows were drawn by me. But it's about 200 feet wide, or wider in some places, 250, 300 feet, and the depth is about maybe 75 to 100 feet, and the arrows show the way these large canals were dug and to divert water away from the top of Mount Ararat, in which the ice and snow appeared suddenly about 2250 BCE, and we'll get more into that in a few moments. However, to verify this even further, there was some geological and topographical and also new archaeological discoveries made in 2002 to verify this again. We consider these next as follows. Alright, now, in 2006, from 1996 to 2006, there were paleoclimatic studies were done, and Dr. Gregory E. Erishian from one of these universities presented a peer-reviewed paper entitled "From Extended Families to the Incipient Policies of the Growth of the Second Social Complexity in the Early Bronze Age of the Plains of Ararat." But notice what he says here. The convergence of several elements of early urbanism, monumental cultic buildings, fortifications, and craft specializations were built not only on the plains of Ararat, but apparently on greater Mount Ararat itself. Here below, what we see is one of these large canals that were dug, dated back at least to the 17th or 13th century BCE. It's about 30 to 40 feet deep here, maybe 50, and about 100 feet wide. And here's some of the people, and some of these ancient canals were also made to where they would let water in and out as well. And this is here at Sourceburger World, second quarter 2002, Discovery in Archaeology. Now, next, here is something very important. This old newspaper article published from 1910 and 1913 in different articles and different newspapers. This one from the Enquirer, Cincinnati, Saturday, April 16, 1910, had this to say about these ancient canals that was verified by scientists and also Turkish engineers between 1910 and 1913 as well. And here's basically what this article had to say. It says no one had understood hydraulic engineering. He might have been able to avert the flood. A complete survey of the scene of the Great Flood has recently been completed, which throws an interesting light on it. The skill of modern engineers, it has been found, could readily have prevented the inundation. The early engineers, although they were brought great energy and perseverance to their task, knew nothing of modern hydraulics or hydraulic hydrostatics. This recent study was carried out in the region of the valley of the Euphrates and was made also by the Turkish government in and around the area where these canals were built, which also included today's Greater Mount Ararat and the area. And it was carried out and surveyed by scientist and engineer Sir William Wilcox with KCMD Company, and assisted by 12 other civil engineers, combination scientists. But here is what is very interesting in the next page in like manner. Now here it's also talking about the cradle of the human race, which may have included maybe around where the Garden of Eden may have been located. It was carefully measured and plotted. It was proposed to utilize several of the ancient I repeat, ancient canals, or at least their courses, and by extending them and introducing modern engineering methods to irrigate a larger land which has been neglected for thousands of years. So these canals are thousands and thousands of years old, all the way back to the time of Noah, right after he came out of the ark, after the global deluge. And next says, the peculiar formation of the rivers of this area is accurately described in Genesis, and surveys have confirmed the records of the Bible exactly the same problem we face with the modern engineers, which also confirmed Noah. But here, listen to this. This region was visited by Herodotus and Xenophon at later dates. In other words, Herodotus saw this, and he came and visited it and analyzed it in about 450 BCE, and Xenophon about 50 to 75 years after that, in about maybe 421 to 400 BCE. And also says detailed descriptions are amply confirmed by the recent investigations. So also the historians Herodotus and Xenophon saw these as well. Now, Herodotus was a Greek historian who was born in Heliopolis in the Persian Empire and lived in the 5th century BC. So, sometime between 485 and 426, he was in this area. Now get a load of this. He was also Heliopolis, born in Heliopolis, Turkey. So, this gives even extra evidence that he was in there to be able to witness and see these canals for himself. And Xenophon of Athens was an ancient Greek philosopher and historian, soldier, and mercenary, and also a student of Socrates, and he saw this sometime between 431 BC before he died in 354 BC as well. So apparently the Turkish government also had records, both lost historical and archaeological records, to show that detailed accounts by Herodotus in the 5th century and Xenophon in the 4th century BCE also confirmed these very large canals that were dug at Mount Ararat in and around the time of Noah, as we have aforementioned and studied in this video as well.